There is a very specific kind of satisfaction that Game of Thrones delivers better than almost any other show in television history. It is not the dragons. It is not the politics. It is not even the betrayals. It is the moment when someone absolutely terrible finally gets what is coming to them, and the writers knew exactly what they were doing. They would spend entire seasons making you despise a character, building that hatred to the point where you are physically leaning toward your screen, waiting for the universe to correct itself. And then, when it finally does, the payoff lands so hard that people were reportedly cheering in their living rooms. That is what this video is about. We are walking through every major villain in Game of Thrones who had a death that was not just satisfying, but genuinely earned. Not simply bad people who happen to die. The ones where the show constructed the punishment to mirror the crime. There is a word for this kind of writing. It is called poetic justice, and nobody did it dirtier than Game of Thrones. Let us start from the beginning. King Joffrey Baratheon is not a complicated character. That is actually the point. Game of Thrones is famous for its morally gray figures. Characters like Cersei, Tywin, and Jaime do terrible things, but they do them for reasons you can follow, sometimes even understand. Joffrey has none of that. He is cruelty without purpose. He is sadism as personality. From the moment he appears on screen, he exists only to cause suffering to people who cannot fight back. The first real glimpse of who Joffrey is comes in Winterfell. He lies about Arya and her friend Micah attacking him. That lie costs a young butcher boy his life and gets Sansa's direwolf, Lady, executed. Joffrey was never in any real danger. He simply did not like how the situation made him look, so he rewrote it. And people died. That is Joffrey's pattern. He lies, he escalates, and someone weaker than him absorbs the consequences that it gets worse at King's Landing. He promises Sansa that her father Ned Stark will be exiled to the Night's Watch. He swears it publicly, and then the second he has the chance, he calls for Ned's head instead. He not only breaks his word, but forces Sansa to look at her father's mounted head on a spike afterward, just to make sure she understood who was in charge. Season 3 is when Joffrey becomes genuinely difficult to watch. He discovers the crossbow. Now, instead of just ordering violence from a safe distance, he starts inflicting it himself against people who are tied up and cannot move. His treatment of Rose, a recurring character who worked in Littlefinger's brothel, is one of the show's most disturbing scenes. She becomes a living target. There is no motive. There is no political calculation. It is just what he is. Here's what makes the actor behind Joffrey, Jack Gleeson, so interesting. He was a young Irish actor studying philosophy and theology at Trinity College while filming the show. He had been acting since he was 8 years old, and his performance was so convincing, so genuinely repulsive, that even George R.R. Martin himself wrote that he worried the role would push Gleeson away from acting entirely. Gleeson ended up taking a 6-year break from screen work after Game of Thrones wrapped. Not because of fan harassment in person, Gleeson has actually said fans he meets are very kind, but because fame itself felt dehumanizing to him. That is a fascinating detail. The man who made one of TV's most hated characters later said that celebrity was an exercise in dehumanization. There's something almost poetic about that now. The Purple Wedding, Season 4, Episode 2. Joffrey marries Marjorie Tyrell in what should be a moment of political consolidation. Instead, it becomes the scene that half the internet was waiting for since Season 1 to hear, is the piece of the story that the show builds to slowly and then reveals years later. Joffrey Baratheon died the way he lived, publicly and without any real understanding of the world around him. If Joffrey was cruelty in gold, Ramsay Bolton was cruelty in leather and rust. Ramsay operates differently from Joffrey. Where Joffrey is loud and petulant, Ramsay is calm and methodical. He does not throw fits. He plans. He takes his time. He genuinely enjoys the process. That distinction is what makes him arguably more disturbing. He first appears as Theon Greyjoy's supposed savior after the fall of Winterfell. He helps Theon escape, rides with him through the night, earns his trust, and then leads him straight back into captivity. It was all a game. The entire rescue was staged just so Ramsay could enjoy destroying the hope he had created. What follows is one of the most psychologically brutal arcs in the show's run. Ramsay does not just torture Theon physically. He dismantles his identity until the man stops existing and something called Reek takes his place. The show treats this seriously enough that Theon's recovery becomes a multi-season storyline. The damage Ramsay did was not something you walk away from quickly. Ramsay Bolton, who hunted people through the woods for sport, who treated every living thing around him as an object, was hunted down in a locked courtyard by animals that trusted him. The symmetry is almost mathematical. Walder Frey is a different kind of villain. He is not physically imposing. He is not particularly cunning in the Littlefinger sense. What he is a man who spent his entire life feeling disrespected and finally found a way to do something about it. And the way he chose was catastrophic. Lord of the Crossing, head of House Frey, master of the twins. All of that amounts to a man who made Robb Stark promise to marry one of his daughters in exchange for safe passage during the War of the Five Kings. Robb broke that promise. He fell in love with Talisa and married her instead. That was the match that lit the fuse. What followed was the Red Wedding, one of the most genuinely traumatic scenes in the show's history, and one that completely redefined what audiences could expect from Game of Thrones. Robb, his mother Catelyn, his pregnant wife Talisa, and the entirety of the Stark forces in that hall were slaughtered while under guest right, which in the world of Westeros is treated as one of the most sacred and unbreakable social contracts in existence. You do not harm people who are guests in your home. Walder Frey did not care. He spent the years after the Red Wedding comfortable and untouchable, dining with Jaime Lannister and taking full credit for what happened. House Frey committed a crime against hospitality. Arya used the very traditions of feasting and hospitality to execute every man in that house. The symmetry, again, is almost too clean to be accidental. Peter Baelish is the character that Game of Thrones spent 7 seasons building as the most dangerous man in Westeros. And then the Stark sisters took him apart in about 45 minutes of screen time, which is either the most satisfying payoff in the show or the most rushed, depending on who you ask. Here is what makes Littlefinger genuinely frightening in a way that Joffrey and Ramsay are not. He does not want you to suffer. He does not enjoy watching you bleed. He is not sadistic. He is purely transactional. You are either useful to him or you are not. And if you're not, he removes you with the same emotional investment he would bring to rearranging furniture. He is the reason the entire War of the Five Kings started. He manipulated Lisa Arryn into poisoning her husband Jon Arryn and then writing a letter to Catelyn Stark blaming the Lannisters. That letter is what sent Ned Stark to King's Landing. Ned's death at King's Landing is what started the war. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that war. And the origin point is a lie that Littlefinger told a woman who loved him. He betrayed Ned Stark directly, luring him into a false sense of security and then withdrawing all support at the exact moment it mattered. He spent years manipulating Sansa, keeping her dependent on him while slowly maneuvering himself closer to controlling the North. He pushed Lisa Arryn through the Moon Door and had a room full of witnesses convinced it was suicide. His final play was trying to turn Sansa and Arya against each other in Winterfell. Littlefinger died on his knees, begging, in the great hall of the family he spent years trying to control. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of looking powerless. And that is exactly how he went. Tywin Lannister is the most interesting death on this list because he is also one of the most genuinely capable characters in the show. He is brilliant. He is strategic. He is the actual architect of Lannister dominance for decades. And he dies sitting on a toilet, killed by his own son, after a lifetime of making that son feel like an abomination. The tragedy of Tywin is that everything he built was pointed in the wrong direction. He cared about legacy obsessively. He obsessed over how House Lannister would be remembered. He spent 40 years trying to produce and shape heirs who would carry that legacy forward. Cersei he dismissed because she was a woman. Jaime he drove away because Jaime joined the Kingsguard instead of coming home to rule. And Tyrion, who had arguably more political intelligence than either of his siblings, he spent a lifetime treating like a walking embarrassment. His entire worldview was built around appearances, around the performance of strength. He ruled by making others afraid to challenge him. He even said it himself. Any man who has to say he is the king is no true king. Tywin understood power as something that was demonstrated through results, not declarations. But he could not see that his obsession with legacy was actively destroying the family he was trying to preserve. Joffrey sat on the throne because Tywin put him there and kept him there. Alliser Thorne is not on the same level of evil as the others on this list. He does not torture people for entertainment. He does not orchestrate wars or manipulate entire kingdoms. But he represents something that Game of Thrones keeps returning to throughout its run: the danger of small men with small thinking in positions that require vision. He despises Jon Snow from the beginning. Jon arrives at Castle Black with a noble name and natural ability, and Thorne, who earned everything he has through years of grinding it out of the wall, resents every part of that immediately. He becomes Jon's instructor and uses that position to bully and undercut him at every opportunity. When Jon becomes Lord Commander, Thorne is not just unhappy. He becomes dangerous. His main objection is Jon's alliance with the wildlings. To Thorne, the Night's Watch exists to kill wildlings. That is what it has always been. The idea that the wildlings might be necessary allies against the threat beyond the wall is simply outside his ability to imagine. His worldview has no room for it.so he leads a mutiny. He lures Jon outside with a false message and has the Brothers of the Night's Watch stab him one by one in the dark, with each person saying the words, "For the Watch." Alliser Thorne died for the refusal to adapt to a world that had already moved past him. He is a cautionary figure more than a villain, but the result is the same. Shae is the entry on this list that most people argue about, and the argument is worth having. She begins as a sharp, confident woman who enters Tyrion's life during the war and genuinely seems to connect with him. Their relationship is one of the warmer threads in a show that does not do warmth particularly well. Tyrion is not used to being seen as more than a punchline. Shae seems to actually see him. She challenges him. She makes him laugh. For the first time in a long time, he lets someone in. The problem is that love in King's Landing is a liability. Tywin makes clear in no uncertain terms that if he ever finds out about Shae, she will be killed. So Tyrion does the most painful thing he can think of. He says terrible things to her face, tells her she is nothing, tells her to leave, hoping that cruelty will protect her by pushing her out of his orbit. She leaves. Or so he thinks. He finds her in Tywin's bed on the night Jaime sets him free. She calls Tywin by the name she once reserved for Tyrion, and when she sees him, she does not hesitate. She reaches for a knife. What follows is one of the show's most complicated moments. Tyrion loved her. He says sorry to her body after it is over. But the betrayal is also real. She testified against him at trial, falsely, claiming he and Sansa planned Joffrey's murder together. She called him a monster in front of packed court. She did not just leave. She became a weapon used against him in the most public and damaging way possible. The show presents this as tragedy on both sides. Shae was a survivor in a city that ate people like her for entertainment. What she did was self-preservation in an environment where powerful men discarded people the moment they stopped being useful. Tyrion loved her, yes, but he also kept her hidden. He could not marry her. He could not protect her openly. He was ashamed of what loving her said about him in the eyes of his family. Neither of them was entirely wrong. Neither of them was entirely right. And that is what makes her story the most genuinely uncomfortable one on this list. Here's the thing about Game of Thrones that holds up even after all the debate about the final seasons. The show built a world where justice was not guaranteed. Good people died early and badly. The plot did not protect the honorable. And because of that, when justice finally did arrive, it arrived with a weight that no other show could match. You had earned every moment of it. You had sat through all the losses and all the cruelty waiting for the balance to shift. Joffrey poisoned at his own wedding. Ramsay fed to his own dogs. Walder Frey given back the Red Wedding in a different dining room. Littlefinger taken apart by the very people he spent years manipulating. Tywin killed by the son he refused to see as a son. Alliser Thorne executed by the man he murdered. Viserys given the crown he could not stop demanding. The show understood something about storytelling that a lot of writers miss. Payoff is not just about what happens. It is about when it happens and what shape it takes. The punishment has to mirror the crime, or it does not feel like justice. It just feels like another death in a long list of deaths. Game of Thrones gave us the mirrors, and some of them were so precise it almost looked planned from the beginning. Maybe it was. Her end was earned, but it still landed hard.